Well, that statement by our president didn't sit well with some in Zimbabwe. Let's chat now to Hopewell Chinono, Zimbabwean author and journalist, joining us from Harare. Hopewell, great to chat to you as always. What is your reaction to what our president said? You've been vocal on the issue of sanctions.
Thank you very much for hosting me tonight. What President Ramaphosa has been saying, and he's been saying this for years, is disingenuous, because he knows that these sanctions were imposed by the United States of America. He knows what our government needs to do for the sanctions to be removed. It's simply to implement the Constitution. I don't support sanctions. I also support the readmission of Zimbabwe into the Commonwealth. But what I don't like, what I detest, is the dishonesty by the South African president and other African presidents, where they talk about the removal of sanctions and not talk about what has attracted the sanctions, and not demand from their Zimbabwean counterparts that they implement the constitutional reforms which are in our constitution. Some of the things that are demanded to happen before the sanctions are removed is the rule of law. It is that our government does not use violence on its citizens, it does not murder its citizens, it is that it investigates the disappearance and abduction of journalist Itai Dzamara. I don't see why any sensible government or head of state would not want to do those things. But it becomes upsetting for Zimbabweans when President Ramaphosa talks about the pressures being exacerbated on the South African social services, and yet he knows what his counterpart in Zimbabwe, President Mnangagwa, needs to do. Of course, a lot of Zimbabweans are going to be coming into South Africa, especially if we don't have a free and fair election. South Africans must prepare for that. They must prepare for Zimbabweans to come and use their health delivery system, because we do not have a health delivery system in Zimbabwe. Now, to give your viewers an understanding of what I mean by the dishonesty of President Ramaphosa and other heads of states in Africa that are simply talking about sanctions and not talking about what needs to be done, is that in Zimbabwe, the biggest hospital only has one maternity theater. It costs $37,000 to build a maternity theater. The only theater that we have at the biggest hospital was built in 1977 by Ian Smith. The current government has not built a single maternity theater at Zimbabwe's biggest hospital. 2,500 women die every year in Zimbabwe because of that. And naturally, when people or when women get pregnant, they are now going to South Africa, because that's where they can find maternity theaters that are working.
What a horrible situation. We've discussed this before. In today's age, women should not die in childbirth. It's simply not necessary. But that is the reality, as you've pointed out, in Zimbabwe. So sanctions are hard, and you've said you don't support them because sometimes nothing changes in the upper echelons of politics, but people on the ground get poorer and poorer, and it just gets very hard for them. But you're saying by lifting the sanctions, even the African nations that are calling for it are condoning what's happening with your government right now.
I would like the sanctions to be lifted because they're actually being used by ZANU-PF to explain its incompetence and the looting of public funds, corruption, the plan of the country's natural resources. It uses them to explain why it's not putting medicines in hospitals or not delivering water in people's homes in urban areas. So I would like the sanctions to go. But the sanctions are never going to go, just like the sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. They had to go after the apartheid regime had done what needed to be done. And so we all know that the American government is not going to lift sanctions simply because Ramaphosa has said sanctions must be lifted. That's why I'm saying what President Ramaphosa is doing is disingenuous. Right now, Francis, we've got a member of parliament, an opposition member of parliament. He has been in jail without trial for over 160 days. It's something that is illegal. It's unconstitutional. Bail is a constitutional right in our laws, and yet this has not been done. This is a member of parliament who's languishing in prison, who's being punished for his views, who's being punished because he's opposing the government. And yet we have never heard President Ramaphosa talking about the Zimbabwean government needing to implement the constitution, needing to respect the rule of law. This makes us wonder whether South Africa or whether the South African government is genuinely interested in seeing a successful and prosperous Zimbabwe. And that's why a lot of Zimbabweans are now coming up with theories that perhaps the South African government wants to continue living next door to a neighbor who's not doing well so that they can continue selling their goods to Zimbabwe. We would also like to have factories like South Africa that are working, to have manufacturing. 95% of our potential workforce is out of work. And these are the people that are crossing into South Africa and putting pressure on the social services that are meant to service the needs and requirements of South African citizens.
What about his call for Zimbabwe to be reinstated as part of the Commonwealth? I understand that the Commonwealth visited Zimbabwe on a fact-finding mission and you presented to them. What did that entail?
Indeed, I requested to meet the Commonwealth team that came, the fact-finding team that came to Zimbabwe. And when I met them, I encouraged them to consider readmission of Zimbabwe into the Commonwealth, because at least if Zimbabwe is part of the Commonwealth, it is subjected to standards for elections, it is subjected to governance standards. These are things that should have been done by SADC more than 20 years ago. But it has not been done. You remember that in 2008, it was President Mbeki who said there was no crisis in Zimbabwe when hundreds of people were being butchered by the ZANU-PF regime. And the irony of us being readmitted in the Commonwealth is that the countries that presided over the suspension of Zimbabwe from the Commonwealth, one of them is South Africa, Australia, and Nigeria. So it was not a white man's affair, as ZANU-PF would like to tell the world. It was actually South Africa, and Nigeria, and Australia, and the majority were African countries. And Zimbabwe was unilaterally, arbitrarily removed from the Commonwealth by ZANU-PF. And because the Commonwealth tends to support a lot more activities for the citizens rather than the state, that's why they were not bothered. Right now, Zimbabwe wants to be readmitted. The ZANU-PF government wants to be readmitted because it sees it as a badge of honor. But as a citizen of Zimbabwe, I would like to see Zimbabwe readmitted in the Commonwealth. I would like to see sanctions go. But unlike President Ramaphosa, I would also add that ZANU-PF needs to do things and implement the constitution, things that will make these sanctions go, and not use violence against citizens. Right now, we are a couple of months away from an election. We do not have the voters' roll. We do not know who's on the voters' roll and who's not. And these are the things that are covered by our constitution. These are the things that are covered by the SADC protocols for elections. And these are the things that have impacted the sanctions.
Okay, Hopewell, we're running out of time, and I really want to put that to you. I mean, President Mnangagwa was calling for peace ahead of the elections. So you say they're a few months away. What is the mood on the ground? What are the hopes for peace, given what has been transpiring?
Well, he's talking with a forked tongue. As he's talking about peace, last night people were being butchered in the Masvingo region of Zimbabwe. There's continuous violence from his political party. He has always been talking about peace, and yet his party does the opposite. We saw the same thing with Robert Mugabe. They are not genuine. Robert Mugabe was talking about peace and stability in the country whilst Zimbabweans were being butchered in 2008. They've always done that. They are not genuine because they are not held up to a standard by their peers in the SADC region. Unfortunately, when these things are like this, if there is a contested election in Zimbabwe, it will affect South Africa. The immigration crisis in your country will become bigger. There will be pressure on your social services, and it is the ordinary and poor people who will be subjected to violence, beating up each other. The political elites in the ANC and ZANU-PF will be living in their mansions. They don't care because they don't suffer the consequences of their action.
Yeah, and we have to talk about this in the context of South Africa wanting to return many Zimbabweans to your country. But we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. And of course, we'll continue to follow all developments in Zimbabwe leading up to the elections. Hopewell Chinono, author and journalist.